My name is Edward. I'm somewhere in my late 30s now, old enough to have a resume that speaks for me, and young enough that people still expect I'm chasing something. For most of my life, I've been introduced by what I do, not who I am. Consultant, manager, the reliable one who stays late, the man who always answers emails, even during dinner. People tend to underestimate me because I don't demand attention, I don't raise my voice in meetings, I don't post motivational quotes or talk about my grind. I learned early that quiet competence makes others comfortable. When you don't complain, when you deliver consistently, people stop seeing the cost. They assume you're fine. They assume silence means stability. This story isn't about villains. It's not about betrayal in the dramatic sense. No one slammed doors or shouted accusations. There were no explosive arguments that made it obvious something was wrong. That's part of why it took me so long to understand what I was trading away, piece by piece. I chose my career over my family every time. Now success eats dinner with me alone. For years, I framed my choices as responsibility. Ambition dressed up as duty. I told myself, and anyone who asked, that I was building something for all of us. And the truth is, I believed it. Deeply. I believed the second line too, even when it started to feel uncomfortable to say out loud. I told myself I was providing, not abandoning, until no one waited for me anymore. What you're about to hear is a slow story, a story of accumulation, small decisions that felt harmless on their own, missed moments that didn't seem important at the time, a life where nothing broke, it just quietly thinned out. The emotional journey here isn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It's about recognition, about the moment you realize that success can keep you warm, but it doesn't look back at you across the table. I'm not telling this to shame ambition or glorify sacrifice. I'm telling it because stories like mine often get edited after the fact, simplified into slogans or warnings that miss the nuance. This is not a cautionary tale shouted from a rooftop. It's an honest account from inside the room, spoken calmly, without dramatics. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through who I was to the people closest to me, how that role slowly hardened, and how silence became both my shield and my weapon. You'll hear about the moment things shifted, not outwardly, but internally, and what it means to live with clarity instead of noise. I don't promise a hero. I don't promise redemption in the cinematic sense. I promise accuracy, and maybe, if you listen closely, you'll recognize a version of yourself somewhere in the margins of the story. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. No pressure to answer right away. Have you ever looked at a life you built carefully and wondered when it stopped feeling shared? To the people in my life, I was dependable in a way that felt permanent, like infrastructure. Something you don't thank because it's always there, doing what it's supposed to do. At work, I was solid. That was the word my director used most often. Not brilliant, not visionary, solid. The man you put on complex projects because he wouldn't panic, wouldn't complain, and wouldn't miss a deadline. I didn't fight for visibility. I believed that results spoke louder than personality. Over time, that belief became my reputation. If something needed fixing quietly, it came to me. If a meeting ran late, I stayed. If a weekend was sacrificed, it was assumed I'd understand. At home, the language was softer, but the shape was the same. I was the provider, the stabilizer, the one who handled things. My family spoke about me with pride, especially to others. Edward works so hard. Edward is always busy. Edward carries a lot. Those sentences sounded like appreciation, and I accepted them as such. I didn't notice that none of them described how it felt to be with me, only what I was useful for. I was rarely asked what I wanted to do on a Sunday. Plans formed around my absence, not my presence. Dinner times were flexible because Edward might be late. Holidays were scheduled with the understanding that I'd probably bring my laptop. No one complained. That was the dangerous part. When no one objects, you assume everything is fine. If I'm honest, I helped train them to see me this way. I said yes automatically. I downplayed exhaustion. I framed missed events as temporary sacrifices. I told myself, and them, that this was just a season, that once the next promotion came through, once the next contract stabilized, once the next milestone was reached, I'd be more available, more present, more human. But seasons have a way of repeating when you don't interrupt them. When I did show up, I was pleasant but distracted, half listening, mentally elsewhere. I didn't bring conflict home, but I didn't bring energy either. I mistook calm for connection. I thought being low maintenance made me easy to love. What it actually did was make me easy to overlook. No one sat me down and said, "You're becoming invisible." There was no intervention, no ultimatum. Instead, there were small adaptations. Conversations that continued without waiting for my input. Decisions were made and then updated to me later. A tone shift. Not cold, just efficient. Like communicating with someone who wasn't expected to fully participate. I remember once coming home later than usual and realizing dinner had already been cleared. Not intentionally, not as a statement, just timing. Plates rinsed, lights dimmed, the house is moving on its own rhythm. Someone said, "We didn't know when you'd be back," and smiled apologetically. I smiled back. I told myself it didn't matter. That's the lie invisibility tells you, that it's neutral, that it doesn't hurt because no one is actively pushing you away. But being unmissed is its own kind of erosion. In group settings, I became the quiet anchor. People leaned on me emotionally without checking if I was standing on solid ground. I was the listener, the fixer, the one who stayed composed. Over time, my inner life stopped being a shared space. It became a storage room. I put things there to deal with later. I wasn't unhappy, that's important to say. I was functional, productive, respected in abstract ways. But I was no longer central to anyone's emotional day. I existed at the edges, important, but not intimate, necessary, but not awaited. And the strangest part, I wore that role with a kind of pride. Being needed felt like purpose. I'm confused about being relied on and being loved. I thought the absence of conflict meant alignment. I thought silence meant understanding. Looking back now, I can see that this version of me was not weak. He was disciplined, capable, earnest. But he was slowly disappearing in plain sight, convinced that endurance was the same thing as meaning. I didn't know yet that this was the foundation for everything that came next. I only knew that I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix, and that no one seemed to notice when I stopped explaining why. The first moment that stayed with me didn't look important. That's why it worked. It happened on a Tuesday evening. The kind of day that doesn't carry memory on its own. I came home later than planned, not unusually late, just late enough to arrive mid-conversation. The kitchen lights were on. Someone was laughing. The television murmured in the background. Life was already in motion. I stood there for a second, briefcase still in my hand, waiting for the natural pause where someone notices you've entered the room. It didn't come. No one ignored me deliberately. That's the detail people miss when they imagine moments like this. There was no eye contact avoided, no cold shoulder. The conversation simply continued. A story about someone's coworker, a joke I didn't have the context for. I put my briefcase down quietly. I washed my hands. By the time someone turned and said, "Oh, hey, you're back," the moment had already passed. It shouldn't have mattered. I told myself that immediately. I had been late. Again. Of course, they didn't stop everything. Of course, the world didn't wait. That was reasonable, adult, logical, but something in me registered the shift. Dinner was mostly finished. A plate had been set aside for me, covered with foil. Considerate. Thoughtful, even. I thanked them. I meant it. I ate alone at the counter, while the conversation moved on behind me, now flowing in a way that didn't require my presence at all. No one asked how my day had been, not because they didn't care, but because they had stopped expecting an answer that would fit into the room. My work stories were long, complicated, abstract. Over time, people learn what's worth asking about. I remember nodding along, adding a comment or two that landed slightly offbeat. Not wrong, just unnecessary, like a chair pulled up after the meeting has ended. That night, when I went to bed, I lay awake longer than usual. Not upset, just alert. My mind replayed the scene, not emotionally, but analytically. I tried to locate the exact point where I'd lost synchronization with the people I loved. The next day, nothing changed. That was the second cut. At work, I mentioned an idea during a meeting, a measured suggestion, practical, low risk. It passed without comment. 10 minutes later, someone else reframed the same idea with more enthusiasm, more performance. Heads nodded. The director smiled. "That's solid thinking," he said, to them. I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reclaim it. I told myself it didn't matter who got credit as long as the project succeeded. That had always been my philosophy, results over recognition. But I wrote it down that time. Not in a dramatic way, just a note in the margin of my notebook, a quiet acknowledgement that something had been taken, not stolen, just absorbed, and no one had noticed the transfer. What made these moments dangerous wasn't their weight, it was their deniability. Each one could be explained away. You were late. They were distracted. You didn't speak up clearly enough. You don't need validation. And because I could rationalize them, I did. Repeatedly. That's how small cuts become normalized. You convince yourself you're being mature. I didn't confront anyone. There was nothing to confront. No one had done anything wrong in a way that could be pointed to. The world had simply adjusted around my silence. I began to notice patterns. When I spoke less, conversations moved faster. When I didn't attend, plans simplified. When I stopped offering opinions, decisions came quicker. My absence smoothed things out. That realization didn't hurt. It chilled. I had always believed my presence added stability. Now I wondered if it had been adding friction instead. Not conflict, just weight, consideration, delay. That's when I started choosing my words more carefully, not to assert myself, but to observe, to see how much of me was actually required. The answer, slowly and unmistakably, was less than I thought. And still, I said nothing. I smiled. I delivered. I showed up late and left early. I told myself this was adulthood, compromise, efficiency. I didn't yet understand that the first small cut isn't meant to wound you. It's meant to test whether you bleed quietly. After the first few moments lodged themselves in my awareness, something else happened, not externally, but internally. I began explaining them away before they fully formed. I learned to pre-forgive things that hadn't yet occurred. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day and accept being dismissed. You slowly adjust your expectations until dismissal feels like efficiency. At work, my role became increasingly defined by execution rather than influence. I was looped in after decisions were already shaped, asked to refine, optimize, and implement. When timelines were aggressive, they were given to me with a tone that suggested confidence, not concern. Edward will handle it. That sentence sounded like trust. I treated it like a compliment. I stopped raising questions in meetings unless I was certain they wouldn't slow momentum. I learned which observations to keep to myself. Not because they were wrong, but because they required people to pause. Pauses were unwelcome. Momentum was valued more than accuracy. When I did speak, I noticed something subtle. People didn't stop typing. They didn't look up right away. My voice had become background, useful, but not interruptive. Like ambient noise, you notice only when it's gone. At home, the adjustments were gentler, but more personal. Family updates were summarized for me instead of shared in real time. I'd hear about something after it had already been processed emotionally by everyone else. The story would come pre-packaged, edited for efficiency. I didn't get the raw version anymore. At first, I appreciated it. I was tired. I didn't have the energy for long conversations after 14-hour days. This arrangement felt considerate. Everyone was adapting to my schedule. What I didn't see was that they were also adapting away from me. There's a specific kind of disrespect that wears the mask of accommodation. It doesn't insult you. It organizes around you. It assumes your absence and builds systems to compensate. No one intends harm. They just stop waiting. I became someone you update, not someone you experience things with. And I helped it happen. I answered messages hours later, then days later, always with apologies and explanations. I missed small rituals. Not big events, but connective moments. A shared coffee, a quick walk. The kind of interactions that don't feel important until they disappear. When someone would say, "We didn't want to bother you," I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Relief because I could rest. Loss because being not bothered slowly turned into being not needed. I rationalized everything. That was my real talent. This is just a demanding phase. Everyone sacrifices in their 30s. I'm doing this for all of us. Those thoughts were comforting because they framed my silence as strength, as self-control, as maturity. I told myself that asserting needs would be selfish, that presence was less valuable than provision. Over time, even I began to treat my inner life as an inconvenience. At work, I noticed younger colleagues being encouraged to speak boldly, even clumsily. Their interruptions were labeled initiative. My restraint was labeled reliability. They were being shaped for leadership. I was being preserved for stability. No one said it out loud. They didn't have to. The pattern was clear if you watched long enough. Once during a review, a manager told me, "You don't need much managing." It was meant as praise. I smiled. Later, alone, I realized what it implied. People who don't need managing also don't get invested in. At home, decisions were increasingly made without checking my availability, not out of resentment, out of habit. I was informed, not consulted. When I did object, even mildly, there was confusion. "You're usually fine with this." And I was. That was the problem. I had trained everyone, colleagues, family, even myself, to expect very little from me emotionally and to give very little back. Still, I didn't feel wronged. I felt logical, efficient, slightly hollow, but productive. Disrespect, when it arrives quietly, doesn't announce itself. It blends into routine. It convinces you that wanting more is indulgent, that needing acknowledgement is insecurity. I told myself that dignity lived in restraint, that power didn't need to be loud. What I didn't yet understand was that silence, when unchosen, is not dignity. It's erosion. And erosion, left unattended, doesn't just change the landscape, it removes you from it. Roles aren't always given with ceremony. Sometimes they're assigned through repetition, by what you accept without comment. By the time I noticed mine, it was already well established. At work, I had become the safe pair of hands. The phrase came up often, usually in rooms I wasn't invited into. I learned this later, in passing, when someone repeated it casually, as if it were common knowledge. Safe hands don't disrupt. They don't challenge direction. They absorb pressure, so others can stay clean. I was brought in after strategies were approved, not while they were forming. I was asked to sense check, to stress test, to make it workable. Never to reimagine, never to steer. My value was in making other people's ideas survive reality, and I was good at it. That's the part that complicates everything. Competence, when combined with compliance, creates a role that's hard to escape. You become indispensable in a narrow way, essential but contained. I didn't resent it. I told myself leadership came in many forms. That influence didn't always need a title. That staying grounded mattered more than being seen. Those thoughts were true. They just weren't complete. At home, my role was even more clearly defined. I was the stabilizer, the constant, the one who didn't rock the boat. If there was tension in the room, it was rarely about me, and never with me. I was the emotional neutral zone. People vented around me, not to me. I noticed that when disagreements arose, my opinion was often sought last, if at all, not because it wasn't respected, but because it wasn't expected to change anything. I was seen as agreeable, reasonable, predictable. Predictability is comforting. It's also limiting. When I did express a preference, a real one, not a polite default, it surprised people. Sometimes it even irritated them, not overtly, but subtly, like I had broken character. I remember suggesting a change to a long-standing family routine. Nothing dramatic. Just a small shift in timing to accommodate a rare free evening. The response wasn't anger, it was hesitation, as if the idea itself had introduced unnecessary complexity. "Well, we usually do it this way," someone said gently. Usually, the word carried weight. It implied that my request was an exception to a system that functioned fine without me. I withdrew the suggestion, smiled, said it wasn't important. The room relaxed immediately. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. My flexibility was part of the structure now. Things worked because I bent. Over time, people stopped checking whether I was okay with plans. They assumed I'd adjust, and they were right. I did. Every time. The role was clear. I was reliable, useful, and emotionally low impact. I didn't demand space. I didn't compete for attention. I didn't complicate things. I told myself this was maturity, that ego had no place in relationships, that my job was to support, not disrupt. But roles, once internalized, don't stay external. I began seeing myself through that same narrow lens. I stopped imagining alternatives. I stopped asking, what do I want this to look like? Instead, I asked, what's most efficient? What's least disruptive? That mindset served my career. To a point, it hollowed out my personal life. There's a difference between being dependable and being defaulted. Dependable means people trust you. Defaulted means people forget to ask. I had crossed that line quietly. No one imposed this role on me maliciously. I had earned it through consistency, through restraint, through 1,000 small choices to prioritize stability over expression. And because it wasn't painful in the moment, I didn't resist it. I didn't yet know that roles like this come with an expiration date. Not for others, but for you. One day, you wake up and realize that being the person everyone relies on has cost you the ability to be fully seen. That realization didn't spark rebellion. It sparked stillness. And in that stillness, something began to shift. The shift didn't happen on a bad day. That's what surprised me most. There was no argument, no crisis, no confrontation that forced clarity. It happened on a day that, by all measurable standards, was successful. I had just closed a major engagement. Months of work, culminating in a clean outcome. The client was satisfied. My director sent a brief message of approval, not praise, exactly. More like confirmation that expectations had been met. I shut my laptop later than usual, but with the quiet satisfaction of having done my job well. On the way home, I stopped by a small grocery store. It wasn't planned. I just realized I hadn't eaten properly all day. The store was nearly empty, fluorescent lights, soft music playing low enough to be ignorable. I stood in the prepared food section longer than necessary, staring at rows of packaged dinners meant for one. Pasta, stir-fry, things designed to be heated quickly and consumed without ceremony. That's when it hit me. Not emotionally, but spatially. I couldn't picture anyone expecting me. Not waiting, not wondering when I'd arrive. Just existing independently of my return. At home, the house was quiet in a way that felt organized, not lonely. Everything was where it should be. Dishes clean, counters clear, no signs of disruption. I reheated the food I'd bought and ate standing up, scrolling through messages that required no response. There were updates, but no invitations. That was the moment something in me finally stopped defending itself. I realized I had been narrating my life from the outside, like a report. This makes sense. This is necessary. This is reasonable. But I hadn't asked the most basic question in years. Is this the life I want to inhabit? Not someday, not after the next milestone. Now. I sat down at the table, the same table I used to pass by, and noticed how little it asked of me. One chair pulled out, the other seats were untouched. No tension, no disappointment, just absence. And in that quiet, I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. No one had taken anything from me. I had volunteered. Every missed moment, every deferred boundary, every "I'll make it up later." I had offered those pieces freely, under the assumption that they would accumulate into something meaningful. They hadn't. They had accumulated into efficiency. That night, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad in the way people expect sadness to look. I felt awake. The internal shift was subtle, but irreversible. I stopped asking how long I could sustain this. I started asking what it was sustaining. At work the next day, I noticed how quickly my calendar filled. Not with my priorities, but with everyone else's. Meetings scheduled without consultation, deadlines assumed, my time treated as a shared resource. I didn't push back, not yet. I just observed, without the protective stories I used to tell myself. For the first time, I allowed the discomfort to exist without smoothing it over. At home, I noticed how conversations ended without me, not unkindly, efficiently. I noticed how little space there was for me to enter without announcing myself. I noticed how accustomed everyone had become to my emotional minimalism. And I noticed something else, too. No one was worried about me. That wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. The role I played didn't require concern. I had made myself low maintenance enough to disappear emotionally. That's when I understood that change wouldn't come from being seen differently by others. It would come from seeing myself differently. I didn't make declarations. I didn't set ultimatums. I didn't confront anyone with my realization. I went to bed that night and slept deeply. Not because things were resolved, but because something had finally settled. The question was no longer, why does this feel empty? The question became, what am I willing to stop offering? That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly, internally. And once that shift happens, you can't unsee the shape of your own absence. After the shift, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit formed through politeness and restraint. Now, it was deliberate, not manipulative, not performative, just intentional. I stopped filling gaps. At work, when meetings drifted toward conclusions that relied on my eventual cleanup, I didn't preemptively offer solutions. I let assumptions surface fully. I listened to how confidently timelines were set without my input, how easily my capacity was treated as infinite. When someone asked, "Can you just take this on?" I paused before answering. That pause alone altered the room. People aren't used to silence from someone who usually smooths things over. I still said yes sometimes. The difference was that I knew why. And I said no, quietly, without justification. More often than I ever had before. The world didn't collapse. What surprised me most was how quickly others interpreted my restraint as weakness. My lack of protest was read as compliance. My reduced availability was framed as a distraction, not an intention. "Everything okay?" someone asked once, casually, when I declined an extra task. "Everything's fine," I said, and it was true. Silence, when chosen, creates space. Space reveals patterns. I began to see how often people spoke over me when I didn't interrupt, how ideas I withheld reappeared later, reframed by others, how my absence from certain conversations didn't slow progress, it simplified it. That stung less than I expected. It clarified things. At home, I did something similar. I stopped compensating for my absences emotionally. I didn't over-explain late arrivals. I didn't preempt disappointment with humor or apologies. I simply arrived as I was, when I was there. When conversations moved on without me, I didn't chase them. I listened. I learned. No one confronted me. There was nothing to confront. From the outside, I looked the same. Calm, reliable, low drama. Internally, I was taking inventory. I noticed who checked in when I withdrew, who didn't, who adapted by pulling closer, and who adapted by moving on seamlessly. The results were sobering. Some relationships were built on my availability, not on mutual presence. When I reduced the former, the latter didn't automatically increase. I also noticed something else. My energy changed, not dramatically, but sustainably. I wasn't constantly ahead of myself anymore, anticipating needs that hadn't been voiced. That alone freed up mental space. In that space, I started thinking long-term, not in terms of revenge or exposure, just alignment. I asked myself questions I'd avoided for years. What leverage do I actually have? What assumptions are being made about me? What would happen if I simply stopped reinforcing them? I didn't announce these questions. I didn't share them. I let them work quietly. People often confuse silence with passivity. They assume that if you're not pushing, you're drifting. That assumption can be useful, because when you stop narrating your intentions, others project their own. At work, some colleagues assumed I was coasting. Others assumed I was disengaged. A few assumed I was struggling. No one asked directly. At home, my calm was mistaken for contentment. The absence of complaint was read as acceptance. I didn't correct them, not because I wanted them to be wrong, but because I needed to see how much of my life depended on being misunderstood. Silence stopped being the thing that erased me. It became the thing that showed me where I stood. And what it showed me wasn't flattering, but it was honest. I wasn't central. I was optional. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It sharpened. Because once you know you're optional, you stop trying to be essential. You start deciding where you actually belong, while everything on the surface looked unchanged. Something fundamental was happening beneath it, and no one noticed. That wasn't accidental. When you've spent years being predictable, your unpredictability registers as noise, not signal. People assume it will resolve itself. They don't look closely. I used that, quietly, methodically, without urgency. At work, I began documenting instead of volunteering. Not in a defensive way, just thorough. Decisions, assumptions, dependencies. Who approved what? When timelines shifted, and why. I didn't do this to trap anyone. I did it because I finally understood the system I was operating in. Every organization runs on invisible labor. Mine had been part of that labor for years. I knew where the gaps were because I had filled them. I knew which projects survived only because I had absorbed their risk. I stopped absorbing. Instead, I mapped. I paid attention to how often my name appeared in internal threads after decisions went wrong. Not as the decision maker, but as the stabilizer, the one expected to help fix it. I noticed how often problems landed on my desk without formal ownership attached. I also noticed how little of this was visible to leadership. At home, something similar unfolded. I listened more than I spoke. I stopped offering solutions to problems that weren't brought to me directly. I let silences sit instead of filling them with reassurance. I noticed who initiated contact and who responded only when convenient. I noticed how often my presence had been treated as a utility, valuable, but not emotionally engaged with. I began to understand the architecture of my relationships. This wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. In the evenings, instead of collapsing into exhaustion, I read. Not motivational books, not productivity hacks. I read about leverage, about systems, about how power actually functions when no one is shouting. I learned that the most influential shifts rarely announce themselves. They happen when someone stops reinforcing an assumption everyone relies on. And I realized something unsettling. A lot of people relied on me staying exactly as I was. At work, my restraint had allowed others to grow faster, to take credit safely, to avoid accountability. I wasn't exploited in a dramatic way. I was useful. That's harder to argue against. At home, my emotional availability on demand had made things smoother. I had buffered tension, softened consequences, removed urgency. In doing so, I had made myself non-essential. People don't notice preparation when it doesn't inconvenience them. I began positioning without posture. I declined certain responsibilities while excelling quietly at others. I made my contributions more visible on paper, less flexible in practice. I asked for clarity instead of offering it. Who owns this? What's the priority here? What happens if this slips? Neutral questions, reasonable questions. They changed the dynamic more than any speech could have. At home, I created space in a different way. I didn't withdraw physically. I withdrew energetically. I stopped overextending emotionally. I let others sit with the consequences of their assumptions. If no one waited for me, I didn't rush. If plans happened without me, I didn't resent them. I simply took note. What surprised me was how quickly new patterns stabilized, how little friction there was. It confirmed something I'd been avoiding. My role had been more about convenience than connection. This wasn't a revelation I shared, it was one I carried. There's a particular kind of power in being underestimated while fully aware of the field. When people think you're static, they stop tracking you. They don't notice the subtle reallocation of effort, the quiet withdrawal of support. They don't notice when you stop protecting them from consequences. That's what this phase was about. Not revenge, not exposure. Preparation. I wasn't planning to burn bridges. I was planning to stop standing in the middle of them. And the more I prepared, the calmer I became. Because clarity does that. It removes the need for urgency. When you know what you're doing, you don't need to announce it. They never noticed the shift because it didn't disrupt their day, but it was already changing the shape of mine. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already sensed it for months. The way you sense a structural weakness in a building you've lived in too long. You don't notice it all at once. You feel it when doors stop closing properly, when floors creak in new places. The moment itself was unremarkable. A routine review. A document was shared late in the evening. I almost didn't open it. It was a summary of responsibilities tied to a long-term initiative I had been involved in since its inception. My name appeared throughout, not prominently, not ceremonially, but consistently. Embedded in processes, referenced in contingency plans, quietly assumed. What struck me wasn't the recognition, it was the dependency. If I stepped back, even slightly, timelines wouldn't just stretch, they would fracture. Not because others were incompetent, but because the system had been built with my flexibility as a hidden variable. I had been the margin of error, and margins, by definition, aren't acknowledged until they disappear. That was the private reveal. I wasn't powerless, I was uncredited. There's a difference. Power doesn't always sit where titles suggest it does. Sometimes it sits in the person who absorbs variance, the one who smooths transitions, the one who makes everyone else look decisive. I had been doing that for years, not strategically, but instinctively. Now I saw it as leverage, not something to exploit, something to finally understand. At home, a similar clarity surfaced, though it was more emotional than structural. I realized that my absence hadn't created chaos because I had already removed myself emotionally long before I reduced my physical presence. People had adjusted. They had learned to self-regulate without me. That meant two things. First, I wasn't as essential as I once believed. Second, neither was the version of me I was clinging to. The reveal wasn't that I could hurt people by leaving. It was that staying, as I was slowly erasing me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. This wasn't a secret advantage to be wielded dramatically. It was a truth to be respected. Knowing where you stand changes how you move. I stopped imagining conversations where I'd explain myself. I stopped rehearsing justifications. I understood that explanations were part of the old pattern, the one where I overfunctioned to maintain comfort. Instead, I focused on alignment. What would it look like to live in a way that didn't require constant translation, where my presence wasn't optional but chosen by me first? At work, that meant acknowledging something difficult. The environment I was in valued my output more than my voice. That might never change, and that was information, not an insult. At home, it meant recognizing that relationships built around my endurance would struggle to adapt to my boundaries. Neither realization made anyone wrong, but they made my next choice unavoidable. The private reveal stripped away fantasy. There would be no version of this where I stayed the same and felt fulfilled. There would be a loss either way. The only variable was whether it would be quiet and internal, or visible and structural. I chose structure. I didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered. I didn't hint. I didn't shift my tone. I let the knowledge settle and change me slowly. Leverage isn't about domination. It's about options. And for the first time in a long time, I had them. Once you see your options clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of lie. For a while, I tried to pretend I could find a version of this where nothing really changed, where I kept my position, my routines, my relationships, and simply felt different inside them. I explored that possibility honestly. I gave it time. It didn't hold. Every option in front of me carried a cost. The difference was where the cost would land. One path was familiarity. Stay. Continue being the stabilizer. Maybe ask for small adjustments. A lighter load here, a bit more recognition there. Hope that incremental change would eventually lead to alignment. That path was comfortable because it didn't require disruption. It also required me to keep translating myself into something smaller. Another path was confrontation, naming everything, explaining the years of quiet accommodation, asking others to see what they hadn't noticed. That path was tempting in moments of fatigue, but it relied on a belief I no longer held, that clarity automatically creates change. Sometimes it just creates defensiveness. The third path was quieter, structural. It didn't require agreement. It didn't require validation. It required preparation and follow-through. That was the irreversible one. At work, I reviewed my contracts. Not anxiously, methodically. I looked at timelines, dependencies, and transition clauses. I assessed what I had built, what I had sustained, and what could realistically continue without me. I didn't rush. Urgency would have meant fear. I wanted steadiness. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing about the environment changes, do I want to be here in 5 years? The answer came quickly. At home, the decision point felt heavier, not because it was unclear, but because it was personal. I understood that shifting my structure would expose truths others hadn't prepared for, not because they were cruel, but because comfort had masked imbalance. I wasn't angry with anyone. That made the decision harder, not easier. It would have been simpler if there were villains. Simpler if I could point to a moment of betrayal. But this was about drift. And drift, left uncorrected, becomes distance. I stopped asking myself whether my decision would hurt others. Any meaningful change does. I asked whether staying would continue hurting me in ways that no one could see, including me. I chose the path that respected what I had learned. The decision wasn't announced, it was enacted. I began detaching from roles that required my invisibility to function. I reduced emotional labor that wasn't reciprocal. I stopped optimizing systems that didn't include me in their future. Not dramatically, deliberately. There was a calm that came with committing, a clarity that removed second-guessing. Once the decision was made, I didn't need to revisit it daily. I simply moved forward. People often imagine decision points as moments of intensity, raised voices, tears, final conversations. This one wasn't like that. It was quiet. But it closed doors, because once you choose not to be diminished, certain arrangements can't survive intact. I knew what was coming, not in detail, but in direction. Loss of familiarity, discomfort, questions without satisfying answers. I accepted that. What I didn't accept anymore was a life where my presence was optional and my absence was convenient. That was the decision. And once it was made, everything that followed was just a consequence. After the decision, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to the world. Explanation would have invited negotiation. Negotiation would have pulled me back into the same patterns. Managing emotions, smoothing discomfort, translating intent. I had done enough of that, so I moved in silence. At work, my actions were procedural, not emotional. I initiated transition conversations framed around continuity, not dissatisfaction. I documented processes I had previously carried out in my head. I clarified ownership. I set realistic timelines and stopped compressing them to protect others from pressure. Nothing I did violated trust. Nothing I did broke the rules. I simply stopped compensating. Meetings became shorter. Decisions took longer, not because I obstructed, but because I no longer pre-solved problems that hadn't been assigned to me. When asked to just handle it, I asked who else was involved. When asked to stay late, I checked whether it was essential or habitual. When something fell outside my scope, I let it remain there. People noticed friction, but they didn't trace it to me. Friction had always existed. I had just been absorbing it. At home, my silence looked like presence without overextension. I didn't withdraw into coldness. I didn't announce boundaries dramatically. I simply stopped reshaping myself to fit expectations that no longer fit me. If plans were made without me, I didn't rearrange my schedule to catch up. If conversations moved on, I didn't interrupt. I allowed absence to be felt, not as punishment, but as reality. This is the part people misunderstand. Moving in silence isn't about disappearing. It's about letting the world respond to who you actually are, not who you've been performing as. I noticed subtle changes. At work, responsibilities that had once defaulted to me began floating awkwardly between teams. Some were claimed, some stalled. No one accused me of anything. They couldn't. I was still doing my job, just not everyone else's. At home, there were moments of confusion, small pauses where someone expected me to step in, and I didn't. Not out of spite, out of alignment. Those pauses were uncomfortable, not explosive, just revealing. I felt the urge to explain myself rise and fall. Old habits don't vanish easily, but I reminded myself, if something requires explanation to be respected, it probably won't be respected for long. Silence held. I used the time and energy I reclaimed to stabilize my next steps. Financially, logistically, emotionally. I didn't rush. I refined. There's a difference between leaving and exiting. Leaving is reactive. Exiting is intentional. I wasn't running away. I was stepping into a life that didn't require constant justification. No one noticed yet. That's the strange thing. People assume change announces itself, that it comes with visible signals. But the most consequential shifts often look like nothing at all, until the structure they depended on isn't there anymore. I was still present, still polite, still competent, just no longer invisible by choice. And once you stop moving to keep others comfortable, the system starts adjusting. That's when consequences begin. Consequences rarely arrive with drama, they arrive in confusion. At work, the first signs were subtle: a missed handoff, a meeting that ended without resolution, a follow-up email asking for clarification on something I had quietly stopped managing. Nothing was wrong in a way that could be escalated, but nothing flowed the way it used to either. People began noticing delays, not catastrophic ones, just enough to disrupt the illusion of smoothness. Questions that once landed on my desk automatically now lingered unanswered because no one was sure who owned them. I was still included in conversations, but differently, more cautiously, as if people were recalibrating without admitting it. Someone asked, "Do you have bandwidth for this?" A question I hadn't heard in years. I answered honestly. Sometimes the answer was yes, sometimes it wasn't. Each time the system adjusted, awkwardly, imperfectly, but undeniably. At home, the consequences were more personal. There were moments when my absence created small pockets of tension, not arguments, gaps, things that went unspoken until they couldn't be ignored. Emotional labor I used to perform quietly now remained undone. I noticed frustration surface where ease had once existed, not because I had changed dramatically, but because others were now encountering realities I had been smoothing over. "What do you think?" someone asked me one evening, mid-discussion. I answered carefully, not to please, to be accurate. The room went quiet. It wasn't hostility, it was recalibration. People had grown accustomed to my neutrality. A real opinion disrupted the balance. Not because it was extreme, but because it reminded them that I was more than a stabilizing force. At work, leadership began asking for updates more frequently. not because they distrusted me, but because they were feeling the absence of my silent corrections. I didn't rush to reassure them. I gave clear, bounded responses. I let outcomes speak. The strange thing was how quickly discomfort spread, and how little anyone traced it back to me. They couldn't. I hadn't withdrawn, I hadn't underperformed, I had simply stopped compensating. That's when you learn how much of a system depends on quiet labor. At home, someone eventually said, "You've been different lately." I nodded, not defensively, not apologetically, just acknowledging the truth. They didn't press. People often don't when they sense that pressing won't restore the old dynamic. There was no explosion, no accusation, just a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted and that it wasn't going to snap back easily. I felt something unexpected during this phase, relief. Not because others were uncomfortable, but because I no longer was. For the first time in years, my inner state matched my outer behavior. I wasn't performing calm. I was calm. I wasn't suppressing frustration. I had resolved it. The consequences continued unfolding slowly. Missed expectations, adjusted roles, subtle questions of accountability. And with each one, I became more certain that my decision had been necessary. Because systems that only function when one person overextends are not stable. They're dependent. And dependency, once exposed, demands change from everyone involved. The moment people realized something was wrong, they assumed it could still be corrected. That's a common mistake. At work, the tone shifted from casual recalibration to quiet concern. Meetings multiplied. Check-ins became more frequent. Not confrontational, just attentive in a way they hadn't been before. Someone said, "We might need to rethink how we're distributing responsibilities." Another suggested, "Maybe we should get your input earlier in the process." These were reasonable ideas, sensible even. They just came too late. Not because I was resentful, but because they were reactive. They were attempts to restore function, not to reimagine structure. The underlying assumption was still that I would absorb the complexity once adjustments were made. I listened. I responded professionally. I didn't dismiss the efforts. But internally, the decision had already passed its point of reversal. When people finally notice your absence, they often try to fix it by pulling you back into the same role, just with better language, more appreciation, temporary flexibility. That's not change, that's maintenance. At home, something similar unfolded. Conversations that had been efficient became emotionally charged. Not explosive, uncertain. Someone asked if I was unhappy, another wondered if I was burning out. I answered honestly, but minimally. "I'm clear," I said once, and meant it. Clarity is unsettling to people who are still negotiating with discomfort. They want explanations that offer hope of return. I couldn't offer that. There was an attempt to recreate old rituals. Dinners were suggested at the last minute. Invitations framed as spontaneity. It was kind. It was also unfamiliar, like visiting a place you used to live, now staged for nostalgia. I didn't reject the gestures. I just didn't let them reset expectations. Because the truth was this: I no longer wanted to be the version of myself that those fixes were designed for. The hardest part wasn't watching others struggle. It was realizing that the effort to fix things confirmed everything I had already understood. They missed what I did, not who I was. At work, a senior leader finally asked me directly, "What would it take for this to work long term?" It was an honest question. I gave an honest answer. And in the silence that followed, we both understood it wasn't going to happen. The cost of real change was higher than they were prepared to pay. Not financially, but structurally. It required relinquishing comfort, redistributing power, and acknowledging how much had been propped up quietly. That's a hard mirror to look into. At home, the realization landed more slowly. There was confusion, a sense of things slipping without a clear cause. People tried to adjust by leaning in emotionally, but without addressing the years of emotional absence that had already settled. I wasn't angry. I was done negotiating with a past version of myself. When you wait too long to value someone's presence, you often end up only noticing their absence. And absence doesn't negotiate. It simply exists. By the time the panic arrived, the subtle urgency, the questions, the attempts to recalibrate, the internal decision was already integrated. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because returning would have meant betraying the clarity I had earned. And that, finally, was something I wasn't willing to do. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like a confrontation at all. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no listing of grievances, Just a conversation that had been delayed so long, it no longer carried heat, only gravity. At work, it happened in a small conference room I'd sat in dozens of times before. Glass walls, neutral lighting, a familiar setting for discussions that pretended to be collaborative while quietly preserving hierarchy. A senior leader sat across from me and asked carefully, "Are you planning to stay?" It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a plea, it was an acknowledgement that something had already changed and needed to be named. I didn't rush to answer. I said, "I've been moving toward something else for a while." That was it. No accusations, no speeches about being overlooked or overused. Those things were true, but they weren't useful anymore. What mattered was direction. They nodded, asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I considered the question honestly, not theatrically. Then I said, it would require rebuilding the role from the ground up, not just for me, for everyone. The silence that followed wasn't defensive, it was resigned. We both understood that organizations rarely rebuild around someone who has already proven they'll carry weight without complaint. It's easier to replace the function than to examine the structure. The conversation ended respectfully, even warmly. There were compliments, appreciation expressed in clear terms, finally specific, finally generous. I accepted them without reaction. Gratitude offered at the end doesn't retroactively change the middle. At home, the confrontation was quieter still. It happened late one evening in the living room after a long pause that had stretched for weeks. Someone finally said, "I feel like you've already left." I didn't deny it. I didn't defend myself either. "I've been stepping back," I said. "Not from you, from the way things were." There was confusion, a need for reassurance. Questions framed carefully, like stepping on unfamiliar ground. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I thought about all the times I had, indirectly, through fatigue, through absence, through silence that was never interpreted as a signal. "I didn't know how," I said, "and when I did, it didn't seem like anyone was listening." That landed without argument, not because it was irrefutable, but because it felt true. There was no attempt to rewrite history, no assigning of blame. Just the shared recognition that we had been coexisting in a structure that worked logistically and failed emotionally. I didn't ask for change. I didn't offer ultimatums. I didn't explain what I needed next. I simply named where I stood. Confrontation without heat doesn't seek to win. It seeks to clarify. And clarity, once spoken, can't be taken back. The conversation ended without resolution. And that was the resolution. We had reached the edge of what could be fixed with words. I went to bed that night without the familiar churn of second-guessing. No replaying sentences. No wondering if I'd said too much or too little. I had said exactly enough. For the first time, my silence and my voice were aligned. And that alignment felt like closure, even before anything had formally ended. Who I am now looks quieter from the outside. There's no dramatic reinvention, no visible declaration of independence. If you were to pass me on the street or glance at my calendar, you might assume very little has changed. That's fine. The most important shifts don't announce themselves. I no longer define myself by how much I can endure. That alone has changed everything. My days are structured around intention instead of obligation. I choose where my attention goes with the same care I once reserved for other people's priorities. Not because I've become rigid, but because I've become precise. At work, I operate in environments where my contribution is visible by design, not by sacrifice, where silence is optional, not expected. I still value restraint. I still choose calm over chaos. But I no longer confuse composure with disappearance. I speak when it matters, I don't know when it doesn't, and I don't apologize for either. At home, my presence is simpler and more honest. I no longer arrive exhausted and half available. When I'm there, I'm there. When I'm not, I don't pretend otherwise. Some relationships adjusted, some didn't. That's not a failure, it's information. I've learned that closeness built on convenience dissolves when convenience is removed. Closeness built on choice deepens. I don't resent the past version of myself. He did what he believed was right with the tools he had. He thought sacrifice would translate into security. He believed consistency would create a connection. He was wrong, but he wasn't foolish. He just didn't know that presence is not something you provide later. It's something you practice now. I eat dinner differently these days. Sometimes alone, sometimes not, but always consciously. I sit at the table. I don't scroll. I notice when I feel full. Emotionally, not just physically. Success still exists in my life, but it no longer sits across from me pretending to be company. It's a resource now, not a replacement. I don't chase validation. I don't chase urgency. I don't chase the feeling of being needed. I value being chosen. By others, yes, but more importantly, by myself. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-respect, practiced consistently enough that it reshapes your environment. I didn't become louder to be seen. I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is the most stable form of power. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. It feels like a settling. Not everything in my life resolved neatly. Some relationships softened instead of deepened. Some doors closed without ceremony. Some dinners are still quiet. That's part of the truth, and I won't dress it up. But the quiet is different now. It's not the silence of neglect. It's the silence of alignment. For a long time, I believed that being good meant being endlessly available. That love was proven through sacrifice. That if I just carried enough weight, eventually someone would notice and meet me there. What I learned instead is this. People don't meet you where you disappear. They meet you where you stand. When you consistently choose duty over presence, the world adjusts. It doesn't resent you. It doesn't punish you. It simply reorganizes without you at the center. And one day, you look around and realize that you built something efficient, respectable, and profoundly lonely. I don't regret my career. I don't regret my ambition. Those things taught me discipline, perspective, and resilience. What I regret is postponing myself, telling myself I would arrive later, that connection could wait, that people would still be there, unchanged, when I finally slowed down. Life doesn't work that way. Presence is not something you earn after success. It's something you invest instead of excess success. The moral of this story isn't choose family over work or ambition is a trap. Those are slogans. Real life is messier than that. The real lesson is quieter. If you don't decide where you matter, you'll be useful everywhere and belong nowhere. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about refusing to be eroded by roles you never consciously agreed to play. It's about noticing when your silence stops being a choice and starts becoming a habit that costs you your place in your own life. I live differently now. Not louder, not harder, just with clearer boundaries between what sustains me and what consumes me. And when I sit down to eat, whether alone or with someone else, I know exactly why I'm there. That's enough. Before we end, I want to leave you with one open question. Not as advice, not as judgment, just as an invitation to reflect. In your life right now, where are you telling yourself you're providing when you might actually be slowly disappearing? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not the polished version, the honest one. Sometimes naming it is the first way back. Thank you for staying with me until the end.